right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining. This is the webinar series on caribou ecology and recovery, co-hosted by the Caribou Monitoring Unit and National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium. The series is sponsored by the Regional Industry Caribou Collaboration. Before we start, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Everybody will be muted until the question and answer section, and then you'll be able to unmute yourself. You can raise your hand to ask a question, or you can use the chat box. Tatiana Flick from NBC KC is here to help if you need any IT support, so please let us know in the chat if you're having any issues. Only we can see the chat, so you don't have to worry about everybody seeing that. We'll aim for about 10 to 15 minutes of questions, but you can also follow up with the presenter or the Caribou Ecology webinar series team as well after. The webinar will also be recorded and posted on the CMU website. So with that, I am going to hand off the presenter role to Martin-Hugues St-Laurent. You should be able to see. There we go. And Martin, you are muted.
Okay, should be better like this.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, let's just manage to have you see the screen, the good one. Just not working now. Let's do this like this. Okay, can everybody can see my screen?
Yes,
Okay,
perfect.
good. So hi everyone, thanks for attending this conference today. Sorry, I just left my classroom a couple of minutes ago for the second lecture of the day. So after 6 hours on Zoom, I'm now with you. So my reflex might be probably in French. Sorry if I hesitated some time on some explanations. So today I'm going to talk to you about the Atlantic Gaspésie caribou population and 30 years of change. So the different results we obtain looking and digging into 30 years of data in the last decades. So just to start, a quick overview of what we're doing. In my lab, we are interested mainly at disentangling the different impacts of anthropogenic and natural disturbances on several facets of the ecology of large mammals. Our focal species is caribou. We're working on boreal caribou, but also mountain caribou with the Atlantic Gaspésie caribou populations too. And because we are interested in understanding what happened to caribou, we are digging into questions that focus also on predators and some alternate prey, with a bunch of really motivated and nice grad students since 13 years now. So basically, I started working on caribou looking at spatial ecology, so space use patterns and habitat selection patterns, how they can affect vital rates, how it can influence population dynamics. But when looking more closely to caribou, I realized that so many other facets might be important. So I started with some colleagues who have that kind of expertise, project about diet, physiology, fertility, predators, parasite, competition, and so on. So there's so many different information that might be relevant that I cannot cover everything today, but I have probably plenty of interesting results to talk to you and to discuss with some of you who might be facing similar threats and similar findings in their study area somewhere else in the caribou range. So where we are now, the wooden caribou subspecies is all over the boreal in Canada. And we in Quebec have some isolated herds that are of great interest to me. You have the Val d'Or herd here, the Charlevoix ear, and a really small one on the south shore of the St. Lawrence River ear. This is the Atlantic Gaspésie caribou population. According to the Kasiowik design table units, the report that was published in 2011, this is the smallest DU that we have, composed of only one population. And at that time, we realized that we do not have a lot of information, despite some clear evidence that this is a DU. We do not have necessarily a lot of information. So I started working on that with some colleagues, and this is the results of, probably a decade of research that I'm going to present today. So this caribou population is an interesting one. Okay, we have in the archives some evidence that the population was probably over 1,000 individual in the early 90s, and it started to decline with some, evidence recorded by pioneer work by Tom Bergerud and other colleagues in the mid-50s, where the population was probably roughly just over 700 animals. 20 years later, the census informed us that it was probably only 250 animals left. And at that time, some federal agencies started to delineate which is the status of that herd. So the herd was designed as threatened in 1984, and a couple of years later was labeled endangered at that time, a status that was reaffirmed by Kasiowik and Environment Canada recently in 2014. The last aerial survey that took place in that herd, so last October 2019, there was only 70 animals left. So you can see that it is a really steep decline over a century. And this is problematic because this population is composed an entire DU, DU 11 is only composed by that population. So for those of you who are not necessarily used to deal with DUs, a designatable unit is a discrete and significant unit that is an irreplaceable component of Canada's biodiversity. So when Kasiowik started to use that concept, they were looking at different factors that might be clear indicators of the unicity of a population. So for the Gaspésie caribou herd, we know that this population is genetically different from other caribou population that are not too far from there. So we have boreal caribou on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River, which is essentially less than 100 kilometers, but the river is so wide at that place that this is possibly impossible to cross and meet other caribou. So this leads the population to be genetically different. We have a huge range disjunction, so this is essentially by the presence of the St-Laurent River that explain this connection of the range with other boreal caribou populations. This is a mountain ecotype herd, so compared to the other herds that we have in the boreal zone of Quebec, this group of caribou are essentially doing altitudinal migration between summer and winter instead of latitudinal migration like the other caribou can do in Quebec. And most importantly, that's the last remnant of the continuous population that was once found across the Gaspé Peninsula and all the Maritimes in northern New England a century and a half ago. So because of that, Kasiowik considered that losing those animals will result in an extensive gap in the range of the species in Canada. So that's why they gave to the Gaspésie population the status of a DU. When I started my career as an assistant professor 13 years ago, I wrote a scientific paper for a French journal here called the Naturaliste Canadien in a special issue about the research in national parks, because the Gaspésie caribou is essentially found within the boundaries of the Gaspésie National Park. And at that time, the first paper of that special issue was entitled, "Is the Gaspésie National Park an efficient conservation tool to maintain a caribou, an endangered population of caribou?" I was interested at that time to, question the relevance of a national park as the only barrier, only refugium for caribou population. I wasn't considering that it was enough to maintain a population for a long period of time. So that's why I decided to just start a research program on that specific area. At that time, we already knew some of the drivers that brought the population to the decline, because in the archives we have evidence that there was 2 intensive periods of hunting that took place at the beginning of the 20th century, and that brought the population to very lower levels. This was followed by an episodic that took place during an entire decade, where the population declined a little bit faster. And more recently, we have evidence that logging and predation might be an important driver of the decline, plus some disturbances by recreationists, because there's a lot of hikers and skiers in that park. So I was interested in putting a little bit more of focus on those 3 factors during this 10-year research program I started at the beginning of my career. And today I'm going to present some results. I do not have enough time to talk about all we did, but some results that I've obtained with some of my grad students, some PhD students that you might know, probably Sarah Baudouin, Frédéric Lemerise, but also projects that we did with master's students like Marie-Audrey, Jonathan, Mathieu, Pascal, Geneviève, and also Virginie. And with Eve, that some of you might have seen at the last North American Caribou Workshop, where she presented some of her PhD work. So essentially, the talk today will focus on some of those projects that are around this question. So to evaluate the impacts of long-term habitat modification on the recruitment rate of the Gaspésie population, with a focus on some components of the apparent competition hypothesis. You probably know about this hypothesis, where an increasing amount of early cereal habitats could bring the alternate prey that are more productive than caribou to higher abundance level. That will lead predator population to increase in abundance too. And because caribou is less productive than moose, caribou will probably decline. So this was the major hypothesis 20 years ago, 10 years ago. And we were interested, like probably some of you, to test that hypothesis in different ranges. In Gaspésie, the situation is a little bit different, because we do not have wolves since a century and a half on the south shore of the St-Laurent River. But what happened with coyotes? So is it possible that this relationship works also with coyotes? So what do we have in ants? We have an interesting data set, because since 1983, the provincial government conducted an aerial survey every year, looking at the number of caribou and also at the proportion of calf in the population. And one thing that is really interesting on this graph, it's that you can see in the late 80s that the number of calf per 100 adult female declined to very, very low levels. So at that time, the Quebec government put some VHF collars on caribou calf to look at survival, and they realized that survival was essentially caused by coyotes and a little bit by bears. So they started a predator control program that took place from 1990 to 1996. And after the initiation of this predator control program, they saw a really interesting increase in the proportion of calf in the population. So they stopped the program, and then the recruitment rate declined quite fast again. They started again in 2001. And since that time, we have a predator control program that is really interesting, putting a lot of pressure on the predator populations with, I would say, kind of, different results. Some years with really high predation pressure and very low recruitment rate, and some years with really high recruitment rate. So this is, for me as a researcher, a very interesting question to look at too. So this is essentially what we're gonna dig into in the next few slides. Before I started my career as an academic, one of my friends was looking at different GPS telemetry surveys on bears and coyotes and caribou, and what they can see, and this is synthesized on this graph here, is that the Gaspésie range is a very steep and mountainous habitat. You can see on the lower right graph here that essentially available habitat when looking at the different elevation zones are between 300 and 800 meters. So that's what we have. And when looking at where caribou are, they are essentially at higher elevations. And black bears are, I would say, everywhere, but majorly found on the mountain shoulders, not on the top, but not at mid elevation too. And coyotes are essentially not found on the summits, but more essentially in the valleys. So while caribou and its predators are divided, they are segregated spatially during the entire year. We can see some evidence of excursions within the park limit on the mountain tops during the calving season. So because predators are very mobile, they can access the summits and kill some caribou calves. So that's what we already knew when I started my career. So I decided to build on that knowledge to focus on something a little bit different. So how did we started that? So in the national park, we have this aerial survey, annual data. We have also GPS data on coyotes and black bears, the one that I just showed to you. And we colored some new animals, so half of the population between 2013 and 2016. We also have a regional index of predator abundance that is essentially a kind of coarse index of the change, the rate of change in the population abundance that is provided to us by trappers and hunters. So this is for the coyotes and for bears, but we also have a tracking record of the harvest that is made by a sport hunter for moose. So just imagine that we have 30 years of data of moose, coyote, and bears and caribou on this specific zone. And we also have the data from the predator control program. So how many animals are removed from the land every year. I know that the index of abundance based on trapping and hunting records are not necessarily the best information because we do not have effort. But at the same time, we have to realize that in this specific area, coyote were absent before 1975, and moose roughly doubled in density during the same period of time. So even if it's not necessarily the more precise data we can have, this is kind of sufficient or enough to try to build some relationships between the different species. So more closely, you have here in dark black the park limits, and you have the critical habitat that is defined in dark gray, in some areas that is outside of the park. And you have the three different sub-herds that we know. So the Logan, the Albert, and the McGarrigle herd that are three groups of caribou that are essentially divided by this road, highway, from two major cities in the region that is cutting the park into parts. This will be important for the next few slides. So with the incredible support of the Ministry of Wildlife, Forests and Parks, some colleagues, technicians, and biologists support the project and capture some caribou and caribou, coyotes, and bears for us. And we give us access to the impressive data set that I'm going to talk about today. So you have some pictures of the work with it. And in French, we say en vrac. Here's some results. I'm going to focus today on habitat alteration because I have so many things I can talk about. Probably this is the most important thing. So you have in the surrounding of the park different what we call wildlife reserves and public lands where logging is allowed. So logging is impossible within the park limit, but it is allowed outside of the park. And in some cases, you know, at the bottom of the mountain tops where you can find caribou, you can see cut blocks like here. So first thing we did, this was our first research project on caribou in my lab. With William during his master, we looked at what we call the functional habitat loss that can be induced by linear features like roads and hiking trails. So here you have a map of the relative probability of occurrence of caribou in the park. You can see in greenish colors here the McGarrigle summits, Albert, and the Logan Ridge. This is the three zones where you can find caribou in the park. So this is a model that is built without the influence of hiking trails and roads that are quite, you know, abundant within the park, but more especially outside the park. So we looked at the difference between the two. So the situation where we were ignoring the influence of roads and when we are considering roads. And you can see that it is really darker red here, which is the valley where you have the highway, but also where you have some other major roads and forest roads in the area. So when looking at what it is as the influence of roads on the quality habitat for the different zones where we can find caribou, you can see that even if there's almost no roads, but just hiking trails at high elevation, the influence of road and hiking trails decrease the habitat quality by 33% in the alpine, almost 40% at mid elevation, and over 50% at lower elevation outside of the park. So you can see that those roads are creating a kind of paradox because we are within a national park, but even if we are within protected area, the human footprint is still really important and can jeopardize the relationship between caribou and predators. This is more important when looking at the GPS data we have on coyotes and bears, and that just showed how important those roads and trails are to access to the alpine. So they are essentially coyotes looking at areas where the road and trail densities are higher, even if in high elevation you do not have that amount of linear features, but they are more prone to use those linear features to access to the alpine. And this is the same, a little bit different, but this is the same with bears. So roughly what we can say is that road and trails are facilitating the predator access to the alpine, which is not new. But in our case, following the pioneer work of Jesse Whittington, for example, that is for us, it is really important because those animals are then able to access to the alpine and the calving areas where caribou calves are during the summertime. With Mathieu, we did something very interesting, a lot of GIS, and we were interested in describing the landscape changes. So first thing we did, we reconnected the different ecoforest maps we have in Quebec for a given area. So you can see here, okay, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but you have the limits of the park. In bluish here, you have the McGarrigle Mountains, the Albert Ridge, and the Logan Ridge. So those three areas where you can find caribou essentially all year long. And you have the coast, the St-Laurent River coast here. The bluish colors here are essentially mixed and deciduous stands. But I want to bring your attention on the gray colors that are essentially mature or immature coniferous forest, and also on orange and red that are cut blocks below 20 years of age. So here we are in 1989, and I'm going to just, go forward up to 2014 to just show you how important the changes in the habitat were. So 1989, 9 years later, 2009, and 2014. So what you can see, I'm going to play it again for you. Okay, we just converted the area outside the park from a mature coniferous forest to a really large sea of early sterile habitats, young cod blocks. So it is not really surprising that the moose population almost doubled in the region within the last 25 years. As I'm going to show you, it has consequences on the habitat quality of different predators. So the next few slides will be divided in 3 zones. So the first one is roughly the park limits, which is the critical habitat of caribou, the first 10 kilometers around the park limits, and then the 20 kilometers outside of that area here. So what I call the 10-30 kilometers around the park boundaries. So the next few slides will all be divided like this, with in black the critical habitat, dark gray the first 10 kilometers, and light gray the 10 to 30 kilometers outside the park. So what you can see from 1989 to now is a decline of the proportion of mature forest outside the park, okay, by roughly 50%. This is accompanied by an equal augmentation of cod blocks. So we have almost doubled the proportion of cod blocks outside the park, even if, you know, the proportion of early cereal stages habitats in the park declined because this is a protected area now since 50 years. Also, we can see that the proportion occupied by the largest forest patches declined outside the park, while it roughly increased in the park. The proportion of what I call interior forest, so the forest that is free of the edge effect, declined roughly and quite quickly, you know, outside the park. And the distance that you can be from a cut block, if you are, you know, at a random point in the landscape, decline roughly by 50% too. So now, on average, you are always at 100 meters from a cut block when you are out of the park. And the edge density increased also during the same period of time. When converting those maps into habitat quality using the RSF scores we built for the different species, we have GPS data, we can see that within the park, no matter the season, roughly the habitat quality declined by 5 to 10% for caribou. But when going, you know, in the zone, the 10 to 30 kilometers outside the park, the habitat quality declined by 30 to 56%. Within this 25 years period. For coyote, it's totally the opposite story. So within the park, roughly it was like -2 to +20% of habitat quality changes. When looking at the farthest zone from the park limit, you can see that it is an increase that reached 66% of increase in habitat quality for coyote. And for bears, it's a kind of mixed results, a slow decline within the park limit because forest is going older, but outside of the park limit, sometimes it's declining, some season it's increasing, and you can see that roughly the habitat quality for predators increased. And when looking at the relationships, you know, the apparent competition hypothesis is roughly a kind of trophic cascade between the abundance of the different species that are at play in this relationship. And when we just, you know, plot the proportion of cut blocks 6 to 20 years old clear cuts that is found outside the park limit and the number of moose that are harvested in the same zone, you can see that the relationship is quite tight. So more cut blocks outside the park, more moose. And when looking at the number of moose and the relationship with this opportunistic predator that is coyote, you can see that this is still significant and this is an increase. So more moose, more coyotes that can be found in the same area. So the habitat surrounding the park within the last 30 years just become more suitable to predators and especially to coyotes. So how can it affect the demography now? First thing, we looked at the variations in calf recruitment rate with Jonathan. And we build different models, using the different components of the apparent competition hypothesis. So number of alternative prey, number of predators. We can control for the number of predators that were harvested, so away from caribou every year, and the different interactions. And most interesting combination of variables that can explain variations in recruitment is when linking moose, not deer, moose, and coyotes and bears with interactions to the recruitment rate of caribou. So we did linear multiple regressions to link together the different variables. And when we partitionate the variance, what we can see is that the most important drivers of the fluctuations in the calving, the recruitment of calves is the abundance index of coyotes, but also of moose. So you can see that this is not, equal to 100%. And it is because we have shared intersection of variation. So when looking at what it means in the stat textbooks, you can see that it is because some of those components are interacting together. And I'm going to focus on the moose and coyote interaction here. And what you can see in gray, it's very low or low moose abundance that were found, I would say, 25 years ago, up to black, where you have the high to very high moose density. So these are the values collected within the frequency distribution. And what you can see roughly is that the influence of coyotes on caribou calves are different depending on the proportion of moose or the abundance, relative abundance of moose in the landscape. So the slopes are not the same, and the intercept are not the same. For those who want a little bit more details, this was published in last January in Global Ecology and Conservation. So where do we go from here? What we can do with those results now? Because I don't want to just show results, I want to start, discussion with some of you regarding the recovery actions we can take. I'm going to propose different strategies here. So the first one is to adjust the timber harvesting practices, also to model the efficiency of the different recovery strategies to orient the decision making, to restore habitat when possible, and also to protect the last remnant of suitable habitat for caribou. So the first timber harvesting practices, we looked at that with Marie-André during her master's thesis, and we compared the different treatments that we can find in Gaspésie outside the park on the attributes known to be selected by caribou, moose, and bears and coyotes. So we used different treatments that you can find here that are distributed along a harvesting intensity gradient. So from unlogged forest, old growth forests that are mature, to the cutting with protection of regeneration in soils that harvest roughly between 90 and 95% of the trees. So the different treatments are there. We sampled a lot of different sampling sites around the Gaspésie National Park, and we built this canonical analysis here that roughly explain the variation and stand structure and composition along two axes. So the first one is the stem density from a low density of trees to a high density of trees. And the second axis is from mixed and deciduous stands to coniferous stands. And what we can see is that the old growth forest is roughly here, and the most important harvesting treatment in the region is right there. So cutting with protection of regeneration in soils. And what we can see is that those attributes are known to be important to caribou, while those are known to be important for moose and those for predators. So the options are, we can continue, the status quo and convert the land into habitat structure that is not suitable to caribou, but more suitable to moose and predators, or to use, protection to keep those major forests on the land. Or we have an intermediate, strategy here to use those less intensive forest treatments that remove a smaller proportion of the trees in the stand, and accept that those stand will have a different a goal. So a kind of a little bit of harvesting and a little bit of protection of caribou habitat at the same time. So this is, one tool we have. The second tool we have is to model the efficiency of the different recovery strategies. Considering that we do not have a lot of caribou left in Gaspésie, like in probably most of the isolated herds that we have in Canada, we have to be cautious about the strategy we will deploy, and we cannot test all the time. So PVAs are really interesting for that. We did that with Jonathan in the second part of his master's thesis. So we have here the different subpopulations, because I'm not gonna present that to you today, but we have another study about the genetics showing that the highway divided the population in two groups that are distinct, and among which there's almost, I would say, no exchanges of genes in the last 20 years. So the status quo situation here is different slightly between the Albert Logan population and the McGarrigle population. But what we can see is the status quo is bringing, after 50 years, both subpopulations to the maximum level of extinction. So those probability of extinction of one here is the extirpated herds. What are the options? So we tested different options. The first one is to increase the pressure on coyotes. And what we can see is that removing 15, 25, or 35% of the coyote population in the surrounding of the Gaspésie National Park bring this probability of extinction to, I would say, almost zero in the eastern part of the park, and to lower levels between 20 and 40% in the western part of the park. So as most of you know, we cannot necessarily interpret those PVA lines as absolute probabilities. It's more a matter of comparison between scenarios. So for the moment, this one seems an interesting scenario. What about moose control? Lowering the density of the most important alternate prey that we have in the landscape. We can do that with sport hunters, because there's a lot of sport hunter in the region. But what we can see is it's less interesting than the coyote control, roughly because we have what we call predator switching strategy. So because those coyote are not supported only by moose, like wolf can be, they are supported by a bunch of other smaller prey species. They probably can influence the demography of caribou, even if we are lowering the moose density. So this is not roughly an interesting example here. So what about less cut block? Stopping logging and waiting for the habitat to reach an equilibrium, a better equilibrium between young and old mature forest stands. This is, a little bit better than the status quo for both populations, but essentially it is worse than the predator control. But when we are combining cut blocks and coyote control, what we can see here is that with the lower level of impact on forest companies, we can probably have interesting results. So this is not necessarily the best or all the scenarios that can be tested, but this is an example of the usefulness of PVA to orient decision making. The third strategy is to restore habitat. So we have so many linear features like this that are old forest or old forest roads or old hiking trails in the park and in the surrounding of the park. We can probably use the knowledge developed by several colleagues in Western Canada to restore habitat condition that could be suitable to caribou and less interesting for predators. We started to look at that with different students recently, but one of this project that is interesting for today's talk is that one when we looked at the efficiency of different recovery strategies and land management strategies for caribou when facing climate change in the future. So we looked at the capacity of closing road as a tool to cope with the effect of climate change on the capacity of caribou to move between suitable habitat patches. And what we can see on this graph from this scientific reports paper is that closing road and restoring habitat is really interesting and might be an important tool. And it is a really huge task considering the lower graph here where you can see the park in light gray and all the linear features, all the forest roads that we have in Gaspésie region and that are used by predators to travel a little bit faster on the land. And the last one, and to me, this is probably the most important one because restoration is interesting, but we will have consequences of those efforts only in 20 to 50 years from now. The most interesting might be that one, to protect the last remnant of suitable caribou habitat. Here you have a map of the Quebec provinces, and you can see here in this red circle, you can see the bluish areas here that are the McGarrigle Mountains, the Albert Ridge, and the Logan Ridge. So you have the Gaspésie National Park that is spotted in blue using this expert-based model built by Mathieu Leblanc. So we had a century and a half or 2 centuries ago caribou probably everywhere in Quebec, okay? And a century ago, everywhere on the south shore of the St-Laurent River, almost to Quebec City. And 100 years later, you know, those animals are along the upper limit of the commercial timber harvesting line here or within national parks. So this is an example that the status quo option or the way we were dealing and managing the land wasn't necessarily suitable. And this is especially important considering that one of the important attributes for caribou diet, you know, arboreal lichens, took a lot of time to recover. So we looked at the biomass of 3 different species, gender of lichens in the trees in and around the Gaspésie National Park, and you can see that it took roughly 90 years after disturbance to have a biomass of lichen that can be interesting for caribou. So restoring habitat might be nice, but it will take a lot of time to recover some attributes that are important to caribou. We did a recent paper that was published 2 weeks ago about designation of protected area network that can deal with climate change and that can ease caribou movement in the land. And what we can see here is that you have the Gaspésie National Park in black, you have some other national park or protected area in black, and you have the different protected area that were pointed out by our algorithm as suitable protected area that need to be protected. And some are really close to the Gaspésie National Park here to the Logan Ridge and might be important to help caribou deal with all the different threats that come from early cereal stands that are distributed around the park. So as a conclusion now, you have a photo, a really nice photo that was taken by Commander Chris Hadfield from the spatial station, and you can see the Gaspésie Peninsula here and the Gaspésie National Park right here. And when we took a step back and look at the implication of those results for conservation, first thing is that the decline of the Atlantic Gaspésie caribou, now we know that it's caused by several drivers and their accumulated effect. So I spent the last, decade and a lot of different colleagues from all around Canada spend so much energy learning things and documenting things. Now we know more, and probably we know enough. Forest management outside the park impact caribou conservation within the park limits. So we have what we call the spillover predation. The management of the area outside the park has a lot of consequences within the park because predators are just moving to get to the park summits and access caribou. I wasn't talking, I do not have time to talk about recreation and all the results we obtain, but we also know that recreation can be an additional pressure. This is not the major driver, but this is an important one. But by the end, this caribou population is recognized as endangered according to Sarah. So we have the responsibility to do something. And I think that we know enough, and we can take really strong actions now. Documenting the decline for another 10 years is not suitable. We need the governmental leadership to take actions, in the province, in the territories, but also from the federal government. We need the leadership to take action, because for the moment, in a lot of different herds, we are documenting slowly the decline. So we have a lot of information, but we need a little bit more action. And probably that restoration in ecology, in combination with more invasive recovery strategies like predator control, penning, or translocation, are needed for several herds. This is the case for caribou in Gaspésie, but this is also the case for other herds in Canada, and especially when facing the threat of future climate change. Just to conclude, I have a lot of different interesting things to present. My grad students and colleagues are so productive. We have information about genetics, management, backcountry skiing, hiking, the influence of trails on different caribou facets of their ecology, parasites, diet, body conditions, climate change. So many things that was built by all those grad students. So thanks to them, thanks to the colleagues, and also thanks to the funding agencies and the partners, especially for this talk, all the people here that gave me access to incredible photographs about caribou and Gaspésie National Park. So thanks to them, and thanks for your attention. If you have questions, I'm here to answer.
Great, thank you so much for that. And I loved the final message, which echoed that of the last NACW. Let's stop documenting and start doing something. So thank you very much for that presentation. It was really interesting. We do have quite a few questions for you, so I'll start and go through them in order. The first question I have here is, I wonder if the number of moose harvested might also be a result of the increased ease of access or visibility of moose to hunters as a result of clear cuts.
Yes, this is for sure one thing. I have other research parts of my research program focusing on moose hunting and stuff like this. So for sure, yes, an increased access, also changes in hunting regulation, because we have different management strategies that took place within the last 30 years there. So for sure, the answer is yes. But at the same time, this increase is echoed by the increase in density monitored during aerial surveys conducted by the government. So we put those data aside because we do not have annual data. Roughly, the Quebec government is conducting an aerial survey every 8 to 12 years for moose. Depending on where you are, or depending of some problems that might occur. So we do not have annual data like we have for hunting. So that's why we decided to use that. But the answer to your question is yes. But at the same time, this trend is also found in aerial survey records.
Awesome, great. The next one is, it starts off with, great talk, thank you. Can you expand on the coyote-moose relationship you observed? Is it strictly a function of habitat selection being similar, or what is it about 60 to 20-year-old clear cuts that you think coyotes benefit from? So I guess essentially, is it really a moose-coyote story, or is there the potential that something else is going on there as well?
I'll say both, but at the same time, a companion studies conducted by my friend Dominique Boisjoli showed that most of the GPS data clusters of coyote in the Gaspésie Peninsula are around the carcass of a moose. So we have, bigger coyote. They are kind of hybrided with old wolf genes, and they are hunting as a family groups. So for sure, yes, they will benefit of early serial habitats, just like moose, okay, because they can find, smaller prey there. But at the same time, we have evidence looking at fecal pellets, looking at where the coyote are sticking in the land, that moose is an important part of their diet. And it cannot be only, carcasses lost by hunters, injured animals that are gonna die somewhere else in the around the park, and that coyote will scavenge on them. It's more than that. It's a real predation relationship.
Okay, great. Another one here, is conservation breeding being considered to support the recovery of the Gaspésie DU?
Oh, I'm not a specialist of this genetic question. Although we did some interesting stuff. I'm gonna show you something here. I don't know if it's gonna work, but okay, like this. You're going to see something here from a paper written by my colleague Fanny Pelletier. So we have two different groups, as I said, of caribou in the park. But one of the most important thing is here, the effective population size is only 16 individuals now. So we will need a more important input of individual in the park, and that can be useful also for the gene diversity, the genetic diversity. And one thing that we have here on this map from a paper by Glenn Yannick, you have the genetic diversity in Quebec, and you can see the Gaspésie population right here at 0.62. 0.62 is quite low. It's one amongst the lowest level we have in Quebec, but it is still higher than Svalbard reindeer, for example, that are roughly below 0.3. So yes, if translocation is an option, then probably introducing new genes and support from a genetic perspective, this bird might be a good option. But again, I'm not a specialist of genetics, and those questions probably need to be sent to Glenn Yannick directly or Fenny.
Great, thank you for that answer. And nice setup there to have those slides ready.
Yeah, I have more slides than I've presented just to be able to answer.
Absolutely. The next question is, did the predator reductions remove both coyotes and bears? And what was the remaining cause of death of calves during those predator removal periods?
Yeah, that's a good point. I've looked at those data a lot of time with in different ways, and just to give you an idea, when the government started the predator control, they estimated that the abundance of bears and coyotes around the park was roughly 68 bears and 11 coyotes, and the annual harvest that is conducted and was conducted at that time, they were removing between 30 bears and 15 coyotes roughly on average every year. And this is an old map of the setup of predator control. Now we have enclosures around the different summits. And what we can see is that we are harvesting more bears and more coyotes than that. On average, an increase in the trapping effort for bears means a decrease in the harvest, suggesting that we are probably over-exploiting bears with the predator control program. But the coyote is totally different. An increase in the effort means an increase in the harvest. So it sounds like we have not controlled the coyote population now. And that's why one of the idea now is to use the sport trappers in the entire peninsula to have them put pressure on coyotes. So, but this is the responsibility of the Ministry of Forest, Wildlife and Park, and I know that the biologists there are great people that are supporting that kind of initiative. But this is, a little bit more far than my expertise.
Great, and that actually dovetails really nicely with the next question, which is, what is the socioeconomic appetite for reduced forestry and predator reductions in your area?
That's a really good question. Okay, a really good question, and it's always a point about the the economic and the importance of the economy of the extraction of different natural resources. I do not have the skills to answer to that question clearly. My role is more to pinpoint the different mechanisms and identify the levers that we can pull or push to make things change. But this will have a cost, you know. This will have a cost for sure. And I know that some people in government have modeled the importance of the consequences on the volume of marriageable timber. I do not have the information, and I don't know if someone can answer to that right now for the Gaspésie Earth precisely. But one sure thing is that we have a species, and this is the same for the entire country. We have a species that is designated as an endangered species or a threatened species if you're talking about boreal caribou, according to different laws and regulations in province territories and on the federal level. So we have a responsibility to have this law apply. And now this will have consequences, but at the same time, should we ignore the law because of the socioeconomic consequences? I don't think so. We cannot start to do such kind of cherry picking of which law we will apply and which law we will ignore.
Great, thank you, and I appreciate that answer. And also, I mean, we're making a decision inherently by not making a decision.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, the last question here, it's not, but it'll be the last one I ask you because we're running out of time. The maps of early cereal over time were very impactful, and I understand that forestry has been a big player in that. I wonder, have you disentangled the relative impact of forestry and climate change on increase in early cereal?
Yes and no. We have started to do that in other ranges in Quebec, and hopefully, you know, at the end of the semester, my teaching load will decrease. I'll probably be able to submit that paper, but we have clear evidence to answer to that question for the boreal caribou herds that we have in Quebec. And yes, on the long term, the influence of climate will be higher, but for the next probably 50 years, the influence of the timber harvesting strategies will be the major driver that will decrease the habitat quality for caribou. So I would say that for the Gaspésie area, that this might be a little bit different, and I'm going to explain why with a photo here. Okay, you can see that you have the Gulf of St-Laurent right here. And essentially, the vegetation in the Gaspésie National Park mountains are structured by climate, but most importantly by the wind, the effect of the wind. So on the mountaintops at 1,200 meters, you have alpine tundra. That is not real alpine tundra like you can have on the West Coast, because this is not driven by the temperature. This is driven by the wind. So you have winds that come from the North Shore here with a lot of velocity, and they are, you know, crashing into the mountains. So this body of water will slow down the increase of temperature, and the wind will structure the edges, the transitions between the different forest types. So when modeling in the future the migration of the different types of habitat, this is quite low, you know, not really fast, essentially because of the dampening effect of this body of water, and because essentially this is driven by the wind, and there's no real evidence that the high wind effect will change in the area. We have that, and this is at the end of my talk, we have that on different slides from Uranus Consortium that are specialists in climate.
Huh, cool. Okay, well, thank you so much for presenting, and thank you to the audience as well for listening in. The webinars will continue every second Tuesday until the end of December, so please let us know if you have any feedback or if you'd like to present a webinar after the holidays. We should be able to keep this going in the new year. And then in 2 weeks' time, Quinn Weber will be talking about integrating habitat selection and density as drivers of the social environment in caribou. So with that, I'd like to say one last time, thank you very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Excellent. Thanks to everyone.
Bye-bye.